Welcome to Freedom to Learn, the podcast that champions choice in education, defends parental rights, and exposes the harm caused by school unions. I'm Jenny Gentles, Director of Education Freedom and Parental Rights at DFI, the Defense of Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. Last week, the Department of Justice announced a civil lawsuit against the Maine Department of Education. Attorney General Pam Bondi declared that the state of Maine is violating Title IX and discriminating against women by failing to protect women in women's sports. Education Secretary Linda McMahon joined the Attorney General at a press conference to announce the lawsuit.
Today, we're announcing a weighty development in the Title IX investigation into the Maine Department of Education. We, the Department of Education, analyzed Maine's Education Department for compliance with Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school or education program that receives federal funding. Unfortunately, our investigation has found that Maine continues to willfully violate Title IX and to strip the civil rights of female athletes in the state. And as Pam alluded as well, it's not just about their civil rights, it's about their safety. And we, after our investigation, we found we really had no other choice. We thought the infractions warranted turning them over to the Justice Department.
In light of these developments, we are re-releasing our Freedom to Learn conversation with White House Senior Policy Strategist Mailman to remind listeners of how we got here. I'll interview Maine State Representative Laura Libby on this topic soon, so stay tuned for that episode.
Your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports, so you better comply, because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding. Every state, good, I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one.
In a January 2025 poll by the New York Times and the polling company Ipsos, 79% of Americans surveyed responded that men should not compete in women's sports. Here's the question they were asked. Thinking about transgender female athletes, meaning athletes who are male at birth, but who currently identify as female, do you think they should or should not be allowed to compete in women's sports? In early February, President Trump signed an executive order with the common sense title, Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports. The EO built on a Day 1 executive order entitled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the federal government. The federal government is implementing those EOs with Title IX investigations, and states like Maine are facing the possibility of losing federal funding if they continue to follow the demands of extreme activists rather than listen to what the American people want. We're fortunate to have one of the nation's experts on this topic, May Mailman, joining us today. May is the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Policy Strategist. She previously led the Independent Women's Law Center, was Ohio's Deputy Solicitor General, and served in the White House during the first Trump administration in a variety of roles. May has been leading the fight to protect women's sports and spaces and dignity and privacy at the state and national level, and I was grateful for the opportunity to talk with her. May Mailman, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Hey, it's so good to see you again.
I'm so glad that we're talking today. We have a lot to cover, even if we just talk about a fragment of the executive orders that have been coming out of the White House. The White House has been flooding the zone with EOs. So let's talk about some of the early ones. What was the primary goal of the Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports executive order?
Yeah, I think with a lot of the things that President Trump has been doing, it's to restore sanity, but also to undo some of the damage done during the Biden administration. So men in women's private spaces treating men as women is not new to Biden. This is something that Obama started, definitely, but it's something that Biden supercharged. So one of Biden's first actions, a Day 1 action, was to say, wherever you see the word sex in federal law, treat that as gender identity. And so that existed in Title IX. Title IX protects women's opportunity, and it says so on the basis of sex. And so what Biden did is they put out a Title IX regulation saying that sex means whatever you feel like. And so, of course, that meant women's private spaces, women's opportunities, scholarships, locker rooms, bathrooms, those sorts of things are going to be invaded by anybody who identifies as a woman.
So, May, I was going through some of the executive orders and trying to remember when things happen, because so much happened fast in the early weeks. This executive order keeping men out of women's sports was February 5th. So really early on. And there were different components to it. It's, yes, to address, just as you said, and to specifically provide direction on what that looks like. So could you dig in a little bit on what happens next with this executive order and what you all were hoping would unfold in the early days as it's implemented?
Yeah, so it has a couple of tools there. So one, it says already there has been a court, now there's a couple of them, that have vacated President Biden's illegal Title IX rewrite nationwide. And so we really want to dig into what those court rulings said and make sure that we are in full compliance. And so, yes, this does require going back to Betsy DeVos's rule, but what else does it require? Because gender identity really just wasn't as much of a thing before. And so what are the affirmative steps instead of just not following Biden's reg? Okay. What are the affirmative steps that these courts are saying Title IX requires? And then we need to, in order to comply with these vacators, we need to do those things. So first, step one, make sure that we are applying Title IX faithfully pursuant to court interpretations. Number two is that we need to then do what we can to affirmatively protect women's sports. And so Biden had proposed a regulation that would have completely gutted women's sports, and then they actually finalized one regulation that completely gutted women's sports. So we've got a couple of tools. One, we could also do a regulation that actually protects women's sports and says women's sports are for women. Or we could say, guess what? That regulation already exists and that law already exists. And we're going to take steps in order to enforce that existing regulation and that law. And so those are the types of things that you see. Immediate investigations. Right after the Title IX executive order was signed, there were 3 investigations that were launched into the University of Pennsylvania, where Leah Thomas swam and broke all the school records, basically, to San Jose State University, which wouldn't even let its own coaches and its own women voice their displeasure by having to compete alongside a male and travel, all this. And then 3, the Massachusetts Department of Athletics. And so now there's been additional investigations launched against California and Minnesota, and of course, Maine.
Well, I want to dig into the Maine situation a little bit later in our conversation. Let's talk about public support for what you're doing. In the past, it might have felt like groups like where we used to work, Independent Women's Forum, that we were the lone voices in this, but that's not at all the case. There was a New York Times and Ipsos poll in January that found that 79% answered that men should not compete in women's sports. What are you all finding when you're talking to the public or hearing from the public on this issue?
Yeah, it's something that when during the Biden administration, the statistics were often 70-30. And 70-30, even though it sounds like, oh, wow, 30% of people don't know what a woman is, 30%, 70-30 issues are actually almost unicorns in the sense that that is like as popular as something is going to get. The fact that this is now 80-20 shows that it's an actual true unicorn, but it's obviously greater than that. This is something that when we had our White House event here protecting women's sports, this was not a Republican event. This was completely across the aisle. These are a lot of people who consider themselves feminists. These are people who have been fighting for women's opportunities, people who have been fighting for the promise of Title IX, people who have been, fighting for all the benefits that not just sports, but just the recognition of womanhood as something that is real and valuable. Those women were there to celebrate with us. And so when we say things like 80-20, 70-30, I think what this really means is that as a culture, as a United States, we do know what a woman is. We know what we want for our daughters. And it's not necessarily women's sports. Maybe we want co-ed sports for our daughters, but we want our daughters to grow up in a place where truth is respected, where their existence is acknowledged, where their privacy is not something that they have to argue for. I think that's the other element of this is, and this was part of the Biden regulation on sports. They said, well, you know what? If you argue for your sport, if you tell us why you can't have the man in there, then maybe we'll give it to you. That burden to say, women, why don't you have to argue for your privacy, argue for your opportunity? that's the type of thing that's just so outrageous. And so, yeah, this is not a 70-30. This is not an 80-20. This is everybody versus a very small portion of people who in their hearts, honestly, know how wrong this is, but they're so committed at this point, they just can't go in reverse.
The language within the EO is just so heartening to read that it is the policy of the United States to rescind all funds from educational programs that deprive women and girls of fair athletic opportunities, which results in the endangerment, humiliation, and silencing of women and girls and deprives them of privacy. Like you're saying, this is bigger than just competition. This is ensuring that we have a society that's grounded in truth and in respect and safety, fairness, and dignity. So grateful for this executive order. Loved watching the White House event unfold on that day of the EO signing. But there are still people out there on Twitter and social media with strong views on this. How would you respond to one fellow who said, we don't have enough scientific data to know which is the correct position on trans women in cisgendered women's sports?
Yeah, this basically has to do with what I just said, which is prove your need. And I think that the response from feminists was a long time ago, no, women deserve single-sex sports, single-sex opportunities, single-sex private spaces just because, and it shouldn't have to be more complicated than that. And the fact that people are trying to take away that right is very regressive. But obviously, if you are going to get into the data is clear. I mean, President Trump, when he was giving his speech at the event, was talking about a cycling race where the male beat the course record and beat all the other women by more than 5 hours. And this is the type of stuff where it's just, I don't even know what to say. If women honestly were able to compete alongside men toe to toe, then there would not be such a thing as the NBA. It would be some sort of co-ed group. And okay, well, what if we have testosterone levels, all of these things? Testosterone has nothing to do with a lot of the elements of the sport. So if you talk to female golfers, so one of the big things that when I worked on before I came to the White House was with the LPGA, and they went from allowing males to now not allowing males to be on the Ladies Professional Golf Association. And it's actually funny because putting is something that actually males have an advantage in, because if you're putting, it actually has to do a lot about your heart rate. You want to calm down your heart rate, and males have a lower resting heart rate than females. And so this whole argument about testosterone maybe will go to some amount of muscle mass, but it can't lower your wingspan. It can't lower your height. It can't change your skeletal frame, and it can't change your heart rate. So the whole thing, it was crazy to say it makes you a woman, but also just based on the science, it's irrelevant.
What happens next? You mentioned some investigations. That's not the White House investigating. That's not you and your role. That gets kicked over to the federal departments and the offices of civil rights, right?
Correct. And so I think a lot of people think that Title IX is a Department of Education thing, and it largely is, but really any federal dollar that goes to an education program, and that could be 4-H, that could be a prison education program, that could be Head Start, that could be college, that could be K through 12, any of these federal dollars from any of these agencies, if it's going to education, then that's a Title IX hook. So after Maine said, bizarrely, that they would rather continue to abuse women, which, like I said, it doesn't make any sense to me, but okay. The investigation rolled in within 24 hours, not just from the Department of Education, but from Health and Human Services and from USDA as well. And these are not small amounts of money. USDA announced it was reviewing $100 million to Maine universities.
So USDA, Department of Agriculture, that one kind of surprised me, even though I am a creature of the Beltway. But my goodness, investigations from multiple departments, multiple offices of civil rights, that is going to keep Maine very busy, as well as those other institutions that you mentioned. When the Office of Civil Rights opened one investigation, the acting assistant secretary for civil rights at the Department of Education said the previous administration trampled the rights of American women and girls and ignored the indignities to which they were subjected in bathrooms and locker rooms. That regime ended on January 20th, 2025. And again, May, it matters when women are reading this, especially those of us who have been fighting gender ideology for years and trying to protect our daughters. So I just want to express gratitude for these actions, for this clear path that you all are taking. Let's talk about the triggering event for Maine. And that was specifically, initially, a male athlete, high school athlete, who was a pole vaulter, I think.
Yeah.
His jump was 6 inches higher than the second and third place winners who tied, and a full 18 inches higher than the girl in fourth place. So once again, a very clear male advantage. So what we saw was an increasing interest in finding out what was going on and a plan of taking action. And it escalated last week when President Trump confronted the governor of Maine directly. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah, the president, a lot of the governors were gathered at the White House, 46 of them. So this was a bipartisan event. And, this is a bipartisan issue. We were just talking about this being 80-20. And the governor of Maine stood up in a room of governors and told the president that she would take him to court on his, but really the administration's request that states, that universities, that schools follow Title IX, the law, which, as I said, is so clearly the law that you have Biden's Title IX regulation vacated nationwide in not one, but 2 courts, and lawsuits in, I think, another 7 courts. So it's going to end up being enjoined like 7 times. So this is, not even enjoined, but vacated, saying that it's illegal. It can't be revived. So this is not something that I think, A, it's not politically wise. B, it's not legally wise. So if you're not right on the politics and you're not right on the law, very perplexing decision. And it was just very alarming to have somebody kind of stand up and tell the president, who's been there, invited by the president. This is an invite to come into his home and speak and to say, I'm going to take you to court.
Right. And he made it very clear, okay, good luck. Also, you're going to lose federal funding. And with those multiple investigations, that is a possibility, although these things often do take time and end in settlements. So it will be interesting to see what this administration does do with those investigations. One more investigation that I wanted to mention on this front, and that is in my school district, Arlington Public Schools in Virginia, and it relates to locker rooms. So the public school here has insisted on keeping a policy where locker room access aligns with gender identity. There was a male adult who was frequenting locker rooms in the high school pools, which are used as community pools. And he's a known sex offender, a repeat sex offender in our community. When little girls were taking swim lessons and changing in the locker rooms, mothers and some older women who were there swimming went to pool employees and said, can you get the naked man out of the locker room? And they said no, because that was his identity, his gender identity. So locker rooms are mentioned in the EO as well. We're protecting women's spaces here, right?
Absolutely. So the women's sports EO is not just a competitive executive order. It has to do with the dignity, opportunity, privacy of women participating in sports. And so the Title IX regulations currently address locker rooms. What President Biden said is that you have identity-based access to locker rooms, which does not mean third stalls. Biden did not say, hey, everybody, make sure that you have some sort of third stall for somebody who's like uncomfortable with their body. Make sure that people who are uncomfortable with their body have third stalls, give those people special rights. It did not say that. It said, make sure that men, if they want to be in the women's locker room, get them into the women's locker room. Straightforwardly, it said that. And so thankfully, that has been enjoined. And of course, the Trump administration is going to enforce that women deserve single-sex spaces. And I'll give you one example where we've already done that. Denver Public High School, so this is East High School, one of the largest high schools in the state of Colorado, said that they were going to take away their women's bathroom on the entire second floor. There's just a men's. If you are the women, you have to go to a all sexes bathroom. So if you're a woman, you have no privacy. You have to go to the all sexes bathroom. And if you're a man, you get a man's bathroom. There's not an example of a clearer Title IX violation than that to say, and this affects girls. Like, I have talked to so many girls and so many of their parents who say they will hold it all day. They will not go to the bathroom, and they are getting UTIs, and it is taking them out of the classroom, and it's affecting their grades. It's affecting their well-being. So this is not some theoretical issue. Paula Scanlon at the University of Pennsylvania, who had to shower and change with Leah Thomas 18 times per week. She would have nightmares. She would refuse to stay in the locker room so she would get out of the pool sopping wet instead of being able to stick around the locker room, shower, dry her hair. She would run back to her home with wet hair in Pennsylvania in winter. And so these are the types of things that women are being forced to deal with, and it is a straightforward violation of Title IX.
Well, and the University of Pennsylvania just told her to go to counseling if she needed help adjusting to this new horrific reality. So universities, K-12 institutions, knock it off. Stop treating women like that. We jumped right to the women's sports EO, but before we wrap up, I just want to acknowledge day one EO, and that was defending women from gender ideology, extremism, and restoring biological truth to the federal government. So I think you've been referencing this as we've been talking about Title IX and restoring reality and common sense to how we look at these issues. So this EO said it is the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female. The sexes are not changeable and are grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality. Why did the President of the United States have to sign an executive order to define the sexes?
Well, in an ideal world, this would never happen. And there are lots of times when I think back and I'm like, wow, it is funny that a huge accomplishment of our first month was that President Trump defined man and woman. And is it an accomplishment? And the thing is, it is. Because we have gotten to the place where sororities with their bylaws that say that it's for women mean men. Just woman has taken on the meaning. The daughters of the American Revolution, daughters means men. And it's kind of funny even overlaying some of the historical background of discrimination. The reason that there's daughters of the American Revolution, the reason that there are sororities is because women didn't have the place to begin with. They were excluded. And so the whole idea of having women's spaces was to have women's spaces. I mean, this was you couldn't get in. And now what's happening is that instead of boldly saying we're now going to be co-ed, the words are changing. So you have a women's prison, but the women's prison has men. You have a women's locker room, but the women's locker room has men. And so reclaiming the language and figuring out what we're talking about, then you can decide if you don't want daughters of the American Revolution, you just want to have everybody of the American Revolution, fine, do what you want. But you have to at least use the language. We have to at least have that conversation. That is our society. Without a language, we have no society. So that's why this was a day one executive order, because it is fundamental to our democracy, to our society, to be able to have conversations. And we have no longer been able to have that if women includes the word men.
All right. Well, May, I am sad to report, but the mainstream media has not fully gotten on board for this way of looking at things. I know that surprises you. So here's a recent headline from the Washington Post. Trump says there are two sexes. Experts in science say it's not binary. Thoughts?
Yes. Well, before this piece ran, I was asked about some comment. It was like, this is absurd. Only the left would not know what a woman is. But you know what? I have a response for this, which is we will take the sex definitions debate every single day of the week. I want to put it on primetime TV because their argument is so ridiculous. So what the left tries to do is say that there's some small percentage of people who have what is colloquially called intersex conditions, disorders of sex development. You've got something wrong with you. This is as if saying because a kid has Down syndrome, they're not a baby or something like that. If you have a disorder, it just takes you out of the category completely. It does not take you out of the category. There is only male. There is only female. But yeah, there are some disorders. This happens. This is the way that mammals, this is the way our species works. It's complicated. But what's not complicated is how we're here. And we're here because there is a large reproductive cell and there's a small reproductive cell. And they work together in a binary fashion in order to create a new human being. And that binary nature, that is the essence of male and female. It's incontrovertible. There's just no physical way to argue about it.
Appreciate the clarity and commitment on this issue. I also want to acknowledge that early EOs addressed expanding educational freedom and opportunity for families. That was a January 29th EO, and I'm looking forward to the reports out of various federal departments on what they can do to direct federal funding to support education freedom. There was also a January 29th EO ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling. You guys have been busy. Any other presidential actions that we can expect anytime soon? We're going to take a break.
The first month was 73 executive orders. And so I think we did more in 30 days than any administration has ever done in 100 days. And I think basically almost as many executive orders as most do in a year. So this is a historic pace, but there was a lot to do because it was a really tragic past 4 years. It's hard to undo 4 years of chaos in a short period of time, but we have to, because I think people very rightly realize that this election was so critical because of a lot of this stuff about restoring who we are as a country. And so there's a lot of things coming up, but really at this point, keeping up the pace, but then making sure that these orders are being rigorously applied. And so that is one of the things that DOJ has been helping with, is making sure that these are rigorously applied. But we have now our cabinet secretaries in place, so they're able to help make sure that their agencies are doing this. So it's the follow-on actions that I would really be tracking now. Is there's only so many new EOs you need to do. What are the big announcements that are coming from the agencies in compliance with these executive orders?
I'm relieved to hear you say that, because I think that there's some sense that, well, now that we can say what we want on Twitter, and now that we have these executive orders, it's as if President Trump has waved a magic wand and fixed these issues. No. This was a first very important step. Those reports back from agencies are going to be very important. The investigations that we've been talking about are very important. And then there's this whole other part, which is congressional. So when we're talking about definitions of male and female, well, Congress has a role to play there too. They need to get that put into legislation. And then we need to also see some regulations that tighten up some of these things as well. May, any other comments on executive orders?
Just that we are grateful for the work that you're doing, Ginny, and your expertise on the outside, making sure people know what's happening, and even little things like we need the agencies to start to work. The agencies, just like the president, are responsive to the public and to applaud when there are good things happening. And there are so many good things happening. I think the right can't take the last 4 years of complaining and turn that into the next 4 years of complaining. There's so much to be happy for, and it's okay to take a win. It really is. Thank you for having this segment to really focus on the wins that are coming, but then also look forward to all the agency action that we have on the horizon.
Well, I'll look forward to having you back, and we can celebrate when we've made even further progress. But May Mailman, thank you so much for your commitment to women's rights, privacy, dignity, safety. Thank you for your commitment as well to education freedom and parental rights, a topic that we can address in future conversations. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
All right. I'll hopefully be back soon with more information.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. You can learn more about DFI at dfipolicy.org. If you have feedback or suggestions for future podcasts, please reach out to us at podcast@dfipolicy.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.